Hello and welcome to Ahval Podcasts, the home of objective, up-to-date and independent reporting on Turkey. Don't forget to follow our reports through social media, on ahvalnews.com or through our mobile app. Let's get started.
Hello and welcome to Hot Pursuit, part of the Ahval Pod series on Ahval News Online. This time we will speak about a hot topic. In a matter of hours, we will have local elections, and 48 hours, let's say, as we speak, in Turkey, which is already perceived and declared as another critical threshold for Turkey, for Turkey's future, as well as the political story of Recep Tayyip Erdoğan, Turkey's seemingly invincible president, and his party, Justice and Development Party. Our guest today is Howard Eissenstat, an associate professor of Middle East history at St. Lawrence University and non-resident senior fellow at POMET. Joining me also, Ilhan Tanir from Washington, D.C., executive editor of Ahval News English. Welcome, Howard.
Hey, welcome. Good to be with you.
Good to be with you
Hi,
too.
Howard.
Ilhan, hello.
Hello there. Hi, Howard.
Hey, Ilhan.
Okay, let's begin with the basic question, because all eyes are, especially among Turkey observers and from the West and from inside as well, it's turbulent on Turkey. And another critical rupture point, perhaps, how important are these elections, Howard?
Well, I guess there's two ways to answer that. The President Erdoğan has as with every election that he's participated in, treated it as existential, as a measure of the continued saliency of his movement. It's and I think that a lot of people have accepted that this is some sort of litmus test on the continued success of the AKP, and there's some degree of truth to it. In the sense that if a very weak showing would perhaps open up fractures within the AKP-MHP coalition. That said, the hard reality is that local elections don't actually determine all that much in the presidential system, that the great weight of power has shifted to the super presidency of President Erdoğan under the new constitution, and that regardless of how these elections turn out, that power will stay with President Erdoğan for the next 4 years. So there may be political repercussions, but in some ways, this is in fact the lowest stake election that Turkey has experienced since 2000.
So in a matter of 5-6 years, we had one referendum and 6 elections, and there is also fatigue amongst the voters. So you place this one as a sort of a low intensity election among the others, if you compare it to the others. Is it correct understanding?
So if we're treating the election as a barometer on how popular the AKP is, and maybe how strong the alliance between the AKP and MHP is going to be, then I think it's still reasonably important. But if we compare it head to head with any of the previous elections, there's less at stake here because the power structure is actually pretty well defined at this point, and there's no institutional way to break that power structure for 4 more years.
Regime change has obviously taken place since April 16 to 2017, and given that frame, also the formation of these two alliances now battling against each other, the Cumhur alliance or Republican alliance and the National alliance, both are mainstream, and they both are representing sort of nationalist, common ground also it's basically more Islamist dosage vis-a-vis secularist dosage. And also you have the Kurdish bloc, which is alienated, sort of demonized even. Are mainstream, these two mainstream alliances, do you see them as sort of an artificial formations, or is it sort of a natural outcome of what took place after the change of the regime?
If I'm understanding your question correctly, I don't think that there's necessarily a tremendous amount ideological that one can point to distinguish the two clusters. There are obviously some pretty broad spectrum differences within those two alliances, but I think taken as a whole, there's more that unify them as part of sort of a Turkish national consensus than that divide them. They neither of them is proposing federalism. Neither of them is proposing a radical shift in how they address the PKK. Both of them are distrustful of the West. The ways in which the things that divide them are effectively over specific policy choices and questions of management, and then effectively the strength of rule of law, right? So of the alliances are basically about, well, we want a traditional Turkish nationalism that is dominated by President Erdoğan, or we want a traditional Turkish nationalism that isn't. That in the end is a big difference, because that's effectively the fundamental question facing Turkey, but it's not ideological.
Ilhan?
There is this question that the economic numbers, Turkey's economy is in its worst shape since President Erdoğan or Prime Minister Erdoğan came to power in 2002. And despite the fact that the economy is very badly managed, and this is very well a consensus, and surely this affects regular Turkish citizens. So why do you think that this economy stupid thing is not working out for Turkey's opposition at the moment?
Okay, so there's, first of all, we haven't seen the votes yet, right? And I don't trust the polling numbers. There's a few things that going on in terms of Turkish elections which mitigate the effects of the economy. We don't know whether they completely erase the effects of the economy. The first is, of course, that this is not a functioning multi-party democracy. We have the broadcast media is effectively controlled by the AKP. Most of print media is controlled by the AKP. And so the only news that one hears is good news. The only explanations for economic woes that one hears is that there are foreign conspiracies. So a lot of that pain there's only sort of one publicly acceptable explanation, or publicly available explanation. Whether people are buying that or not is still an open question. We'll know Sunday. The second part of that is that one of the things that we can tell, looking at the United States, looking at Great Britain, looking at Turkey, people don't necessarily vote their economic interests. The truth is that party affiliation is often very strong, that we're seeing in the age of new media a kind of political polarization in a lot of countries.
And tribalism.
And tribalism always has a there's a bad taste in my mouth whenever we apply it to the Middle East because it's so often misused, but it's sort of political tribalism, if you will, a partisanship that mitigates economic experience.
I understand. Let's entertain two scenarios in which Erdoğan loses Istanbul and Ankara. You still think that?
I think that there's no chance that he will lose Istanbul.
There's no chance that he will lose Istanbul. Is that what you said?
That's right. I think that he will. Now this is based on my assumptions that that we're not experiencing free and fair elections. Mm-hmm. I have no idea what a free and fair election would result. My profound belief is that President Erdoğan will not accept a loss in Istanbul, and that if minor manipulation is enough to put him over the top, then that's fine. But on Istanbul, I think he would be ready for broad-scale manipulation in order to achieve that. Mm-hmm. If I'm wrong, then I'm wrong. Then I'll need to really rethink how I'm addressing Turkish elections.
Perhaps we can address it after the election if you are wrong, but
give me a couple of weeks to think about it. but on Ankara, I think the stakes on Ankara are lower. I think I think that there's more demonstrated fear on the part of the AKP with regard to Ankara. Right? We don't see the sort of same rhetorical bomb throwing on Istanbul that we've seen on Ankara, where Mansur Yavaş has really been sort of portrayed as a public enemy. And so my sense in Ankara, I think that there's three possibilities. The AKP could win with minor manipulation. It could the AKP could win with large-scale manipulation. I think the relative cost benefits of large-scale manipulation in Ankara is quite different from the cost benefits of large-scale manipulation in Istanbul. That's why I see it as less likely in Ankara. And then the third option is that Yavaş wins and that they prosecute him afterwards and put in a trustee.
Right.
Yes.
You have a follow-up question.
How about the Kurds? If Kurds will take
before the Kurds, I think we should stay there because these two cities are, of course, important symbolically, especially Istanbul. And in terms of sort of realistic, pessimistic outlook, I tend to share Howard's views over the years. But still, I mean, economy has sort of replaced as number one worry for the citizenry, if one is to trust at least some very few pollsters. It's not like in the summer of 2015 when people were seeing terrorism, violence as the number one issue of worry. So it will play an important role. And the real battlefields for the change, if any, will take place in 12 of the 30 greater municipalities. Those are the sort of candidates for swing municipalities, and that includes, of course, Istanbul, Ankara, Bursa, and Mersin, Adana, etc. Let's focus on a scenario where, if not Istanbul, the opposition alliance wins some of these cities, Ankara, Bursa, etc. What will it mean for this mainstream opposition bloc? How do you see that? What will it mean?
Well, I wouldn't be surprised if the opposition gets some wins. I don't think that's unlikely. My sense, look, to reframe that a little bit, why does the opposition need to win? It's not going to fundamentally change structures. Holding municipalities has some long-term advantages for the opposition, even if these contests are, as I maintain, unfree and unfair. The first is that it gives them access to resources, access to tax base, and it gives them the capacity to develop new leadership. Turkey's in an odd place. It's got a deeply authoritarian government, but it's got a public that believes in a way that few other authoritarian regimes do. It has a country. It has a population that believes in contested elections, and that makes me somewhat hopeful that on the medium or long term, there may be new opportunities for contesting Turkey's future.
But given the hyper centralized presidency, on which Erdoğan makes it very clear in the past 3-4 days.
I'm talking, when I say medium to long term, I'm talking 5 to 10 years.
I see. Okay, all right.
And so my feeling is, why are these elections important for the opposition? Not because they can win on some broad scale, not because they can fundamentally break Erdoğan's hold on power. I think there's two potential outcomes that for the opposition. The first is that they could do so well that Erdoğan's forced to be more repressive and sort of undermine his own persona as a democratically elected governor. In other words, blatant cheating, right? I talk about voting manipulation. A blatant cheating, mass manipulation has much higher costs for him. The second, and undermines his legitimacy. The second outcome, and maybe the more likely outcome, is that they win enough places that A, they can protect the interests of party loyalists, and B, right, because there's the experience of living under, if you're a CHP supporter, the experience of living under a CHP municipality is quite different from living under an AKP municipality. The second thing that it does, though, is it allows the CHP or the E party to develop potential new leadership. There's 4 years down the line, 10 years down the line, there's going to be new elections, and the opposition parties are going to have to put forward people who have experience in governance and leadership. And if they don't have any wins on the board at the municipal level, then they don't have people to put forward later on.
I see.
Does that make sense?
Yes, Ilhan?
Yes. If we talk about the Kurds and the Southeast, polls showing that they're going to take back those cities which were taken by the government, Ankara, by trustees. Do you think going forward after the local elections, there is any reason for Erdoğan not to repeat and take over the same cities? And if he will if you see any kind of cost for him?
Okay, so at the policy level, I think that reinitiating the peace process is difficult, but utterly necessary, and I'll explain why in a second. As a practical matter, I don't think that Erdoğan's going to do that. I think that he's going to continue to take a hard line on the PKK. I think that he's going to continue to target the HDP. I think that the voters in the Southeast are going to vote HDP, and then their duly elected representatives will be summarily taken out of office and trustees put into office just the same way as they were in 2014. And I think that he's promised as much. Here's the thing that I haven't heard people talk about, but is weighing heavily on my mind, which is that as the situation, and I assume the situation is going to become more acceptable to Turkey in northern Syria, as the YPG position in northern Syria breaks down, as its alliance with, as the YPG's alliance with the United States breaks down. I think that we're probably going to see a resurgence of the kind of urban warfare that we saw in an earlier phase of the conflict, because none of the basic rationales for the or none of the basic tools for that urban warfare have gone away, right? The reason that urban warfare seems to have diminished is because it was costly to the YPG-U.S. relationship. With the U.S. increasingly off the table, and with no peace process in sight, the likelihood, it seems to me, of a dramatic increase of violence in Turkey increases. And so, from my perspective, the Turkish government should be thinking really hard about ways to bring a security process back into a political process, while the Turkish government still sort of has some wins on its scoreboard. I don't think that that's what it's going to do, but I think that as a policy matter, that's what it really needs to do.
Let's see.
Got it.
We have about 5 minutes to go, Ilhan. Maybe two more questions. One for you.
Okay. On the foreign policy aspect of these elections, if Erdoğan goes through with this and without a big defeat, some result that he can present as a success, how do you vision post-election Erdoğan till 2023? Is he going to continue aligned with Russia, or do you see any chance of Erdoğan coming back to the Western alliance, including NATO and decisions like S-400s?
Well, so let me separate that a little bit. I think the S-400s is a done deal. I think that...
you mean irreversible?
I think it's irreversible. Not in theory. In theory, it's reversible, but in practice, I don't think that the Turkish government has any inclination to back down. And I think that the U.S. sanctions are certain as well. I would suggest that an so tensions between Turkey and the United States are likely to increase pretty dramatically, and I don't see any way to get off of that highway. That said, Turkey still needs the EU, and the United States is a big part of NATO, but it's not the only part of NATO. I don't think that what we're going to see is a clear-cut Turkish shift from Western alliance to an alliance with Russia. I think what we're seeing is a growing dependence on Russia, but economically, Turkey still is tied to the EU, and the EU is in many ways tied to Turkey. So I think it's a more complex tableau than an either or. The real question for me, I don't think that on those big security issues, I don't think that Erdoğan's going to be fundamentally different after this election than he's been before this election. I think that in effect, we know who Erdoğan is, and we know sort of how he views the world. And he will moderate that or intensify the language around it, depending on circumstances, the fundamental path that he takes has been pretty clear cut for at least a decade. The issue that I have larger questions on is how he deals with the economy, because the economic costs are very real. They're very immediate, and he either sort of rationalizes Turkish economic policy, or he asks the IMF to rationalize it for him, and neither of those are going to be very palatable. But we've seen elsewhere. I'm thinking of Brexit, tremendously self-destructive policies undertaken by political leaders who simply can't bring sort of their ideological predilections and the practical realities together. So it seems to me that a rationalization of the Turkish economy needs to happen. Whether it will happen or not, I don't know.
I see. So let's round it up. We have only a matter of minutes. In the short term, do you see any prospect for early elections and any prospect for IMF entering in?
Early elections, no. IMF, maybe. How's that for brief?
that was as brief as one can expect. So, in a summary, the last words. You see it as sort of a minor scale election which will not shatter the ground below Erdoğan. That's how we understand it.
Yeah, here's my basic take as a historian, which is the status quo seems pretty stable, but status quo seems stable right up until the moment they're not. And I don't know what sort of we can't know in advance whether a black swan event is going to shatter the status quo. The status quo is what we're going to have for the time being.
Let's see. Our guest today was Howard Eissenstat, Associate Professor of Middle East History at St. Lawrence University and non-resident Senior Fellow at POMET. Thank you for this wonderful conversation, Howard.
My pleasure. Good to talk to you.
Thank you, Howard.
And Ilhan, thank you too.
Thank you.